Let me just say what an absolute pleasure it is to be here in a city that I deeply love and has been my home for many years during my formative years. So I'd like to start by thanking colleagues at the University of Glasgow who are hosting us today. It's very meaningful that we are here for the launch of this specific State of the Nations. For those of you who don't know us, we are the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Center, or Creative PEC. We are funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council to produce the evidence base needed to take informed policymaking decisions across the UK. Together with our partners, we deliver our flash regular reports in the form of these State of the Nations reports. We are very proud to launch this from Glasgow today. In our reports that engage with four key thematic areas: R&D, innovation and clusters, internationalization, education, skills and talent, and of course, arts, culture and heritage, we always try to take, whenever possible, the UK-wide, national and regional angle, because the challenges and opportunities of the creative industries do not really see borders, and neither should the evidence base. And it is very meaningful that this report today is launched from Glasgow and from Scotland. Again, what makes this report exceptional, I think, is beyond the UK-wide picture, is the granularity of data that is critical to inform local policymakers. Because the report is not just going to, doesn't just tell us how high or low engagement is with culture, but it's also what the disparities are, what the differences are, where the gaps sit. Also, the report quite uniquely gives data that can be used, and we have a range of Power BIs and data infographics that can be visualized and used by people online. Without any further ado, I would like to just give the floor to my colleague Rebecca, who's going to chair the session. Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. And my name is Rebecca Madgen. I'm a Professor of Urban Studies here at the University of Glasgow and also the Director of the AHRC's PLACE programme. And it's a real pleasure. We're really delighted to welcome Creative PEC. I've been a long admirer of the work that you do. And it's really interesting, I think, to be able to think together about the place-based consequences of some of the things that we'll hear about in the report, not just from a workforce perspective, but also about how you act and live and feel in the places that you work, live and play in. So for those of you who don't know what the PLACE programme is, I'll just share a couple of minutes to sort of contextualise how we're trying to bring these two strategic investments from AHRC together. So our programme tries to advance people-centred place-based approaches, and we work with a range of partners across the arts, cultural heritage and architecture sectors on a number of place-based challenges. And within this, I think we see place as a kind of organising principle, if you like, or mechanics to help us think differently about how we might deliver public services more relationally, less in silos, less transactional, and the roles of arts, culture and heritage in delivering those kinds of public policy priorities, but also thinking about it as a set of investment preferences as well, and how we can think about the sort of creative sectors as being shaped by the characteristics of place and the way that they are delivered in and of place. Crucially, I think place is an organising framework, but for us, it's all held together. You might expect this being in an academic setting. It's all held together by a kind of evidence conceptual framework. And so when we talk about place, we don't just mean an organising framework in terms of an administrative boundary area or a geographic location. For us, the most important thing, and I think it came out really nicely in the report, is also that place is a meaningful geographic location. And so that insertion of the word meaningful is not incidental and semantic, but actually it's crucial to the way that we think we can advance a different way of thinking and doing in place. And so the kinds of things that you'll hear when I pass on in a second to Mark, and hopefully will come out in the discussion later, is that you'll hear a lot about the kinds of data that can be generated. And I think what we're coming together here in the PLACE and the PEC is to think about together how that feels on the ground. So how it plays out in our everyday lived and crucially what we call felt experiences of place. And what we mean by that is very simply how we feel in and about places. They could be our immediate emotional responses to watching a particular TV or film about our place, or going to a theatre in our place. It could be pride or joy, anger or apathy. It also, crucially, I think, not just within the workforce, thinks about things like loneliness and disempowerment, both the way that that plays out within occupations, but also within our everyday lives as well. And it takes us into a space also about more collective and durable understandings of belonging and attachment. And we know that these are vital to the health of the workforce, to individuals, communities, and also to places. We know that people need meaningful relationships with places almost as much as they do other people. But how do we bring this more centrally and more formally into the kinds of decisions that guide how workforces operate and how people experience culture and art and heritage within their places? And a lot of this is therefore hidden. I think we all probably have places that matter to us and art forms that matter to us, things that we go and do because they satiate some part of what's important to us. But they often lie beneath the surface. Sometimes, unfortunately, they explode on the streets, but they're always present. And because they're always present, because they're an existential need, they produce different kinds of socioeconomic outcomes. And so I think today what I'm really excited to explore really is that relationship between what we do and how we live and how we feel in place, and how we can maybe bring those things together. So the crucial data that you'll hear from Mark now matters and goes beyond the numbers and the graphs, because I think the things that the report shows and opens up a set of conversations about how it feels to live, work and play in urban and rural places across Scotland, and how in turn that shapes our life courses and a set of particular kinds of socio-economic outcomes. That's enough from me. You'll hear from me a little bit later as I chair the panel, but for now, I'd like to introduce you to Mark Taylor, who's a professor at the University of Sheffield, also on the Department of Culture and Media and Sports College of Experts, and he will introduce the report findings for you. Over to you.
Fab. Thanks very much, Rebecca. Thank you, everybody, for joining us both in person and online, and indeed if you watch this online subsequently. My name is Mark Taylor. I work at the University of Sheffield. I am not planning on talking for too long because we've got a really excellent panel that I'm very excited to be a part of people who are very much experts in Scottish cultural life and Scottish cultural policy. But I'm going to give a couple of highlights of the report that has been published by the Creative Pack today, where we've been reflecting on audiences and workforces across the UK and with a focus on Scotland. It looks like this, and by way of background, there's been quite a lot going on in Scottish cultural policy in the last few years. There has been an independent review of Creative Scotland, which has published a series of recommendations. There's been a culture strategy for Scotland, which has accompanied an action plan, which has included a recommendation for an independent culture fair work task force. We have the chair of that task force here today. I'm very excited to hear from that person, who will introduce themselves in due course. But it means that it's all quite lively. There has been a lot of recommendations and a lot of changes, while also acknowledging a series of challenges associated with cultural funding and cultural life in Scotland. The only decisions that are made that impact culture in Scotland are made in Scotland alone. The UK Town of Culture has been announced as policy intervention at some point in the last 12 months. This screenshot is from the guidance for bidders that was published about 3 months ago. Greenock, I know, is in the mix. There'll be others that I can't remember off the top of my head. Cultural policy is devolved, but there's quite a lot going on in a very lively setting. And the way that we have structured this report is in a few different main areas. We start by talking a little bit about the workforce in Scotland and then across the UK, drawing from data from the 2022 census and from the Labour Force survey, which covers the whole of the UK over a series of years. And then we look a little bit at participation. I'm not going to talk about England today, where we then draw a few comparisons. So I'll start with workforce. And some people might be familiar with data that looks a little bit like this. One of the things that we've been consistently doing in our reporting through Creative Pack is publishing consistent data on the composition of the arts, culture and heritage workforce across the UK, looking at things like the balance of people who are employed versus self-employed, the balance of people who are, percentages of people who are disabled, percentages of people who are white, the percentages of people who are men, and the percentages of people from different kinds of backgrounds. And to be honest, the story is not one of a lot of variety. We see that some of the patterns that have been published over a number of years by different people are relatively stubborn patterns. There's been a lot of different kinds of interventions and challenges, but these don't seem to be obviously making immediate changes. I don't think we should expect them to. I don't think a policy intervention, I don't think anyone would expect a 20 percentage point difference on a year-by-year basis on the basis of those interventions. But equally, we do need to keep an eye on these things. Insofar as there does seem to be a trend, we've noticed in the last sort of period 2024, 2025, this data goes up to the end of 2025, a decrease in the percentage of people working in occupations associated with film, TV, video, radio, and photography who are men. This might be a blip. We've seen this before, did this, and then did this again. But we're keeping an eye on it because this does seem to be the one trend that doesn't just seem to be purely bouncing up and down. But the thing that I'm most excited, this is the best slide. I was saying before that we'd be talking about some of the data from Scotland Census, which took place in 2022. The good people of National Records for Scotland, whom I love to bits, shared a table with us, which includes data on the numbers of people in each of Scotland's council areas or local authorities who work in occupations that we would describe as arts, culture and heritage occupations. The full list of those precise occupations is included in the report. And I think this is amazingly interesting. It probably won't come as a surprise to a lot of people in the room to learn that the council areas with the largest percentage of people working in those occupations are Edinburgh and Glasgow. But the one in third place is the Western Isles. Stirling's pretty high. And more broadly, we do not see patterns of either agglomeration, where the places with the largest percentages of people working in these occupations are bordered by other council areas with relatively high percentages, nor do we see a pattern which we see in other parts of the world where creative work is heavily concentrated in cities. In fact, in Scotland, while the two big cities in the Central Belt are the areas with the highest percentages, other parts of the country with high percentages are all over the place. This is partly reflexive of the fact that creative occupations are very varied. It is different being a camera operator from being a glassmaker working in crafts. And it's for that reason that Roshi Wang, who is a research associate who works with us on Creative Pec, has built a series of dashboards which allows us to, amongst other things, look at the numbers of people in specific occupations in different council areas in Scotland. And so in the 2022 census, 6,809 people in Scotland said that their main job was as an artist. The largest percentage of people saying this were in the Western Isles and in Orkney. You can run through the different occupations and see the spatial patternings, but there's a lot of variation, much more than you see in other comparative parts of the world. And so that's some data about the workforce. Moving to think about participation, we've also, so part of the goal of this report was to really do our best to unpick some data about Scotland. Cultural activity in Scotland is very lively. The activity that most people do is they read for pleasure. Loads of people go to the cinema, loads of people go to gigs, loads of people say that they've been to a historic place at some point in the last 12 months. About 20-ish%, a little more, of people say that they haven't gone to any of the events that I've included in this figure, which you can see in blue. A little bit more than that say that they haven't participated in activity, including things like participating in crafts, writing music, and dancing. The percentage of people in Scotland who say that they've been dancing is so much higher than the other home nations of the UK, which is lovely. But it's not all good news. One of the things that comes through quite strongly is that a lot of modes of cultural engagement in Scotland are really marked by different forms of social inequalities. I'm going to draw attention to two here. First one's disability. In Scotland, the percentages of people who are disabled who attend different kinds of events, these include things like going to cinema and going to gigs, those percentages are quite a bit lower than the percentages of people who aren't disabled who are doing those same things. And these gaps are wider than we see in other places. There's quite a few potential explanations for that. I don't want to get into those now because, to be honest, I will be speculating, but it might be that that's something that we can pick up during the course of the discussion. We also see, there's a lot going on here, but we also see quite big differences by the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. Areas of higher deprivation see pretty pronounced differences in a lot of different kinds of activities. Examples include percentages of people who go to art galleries in the least deprived areas. That number is maybe more than double the equivalent figure for people living in the most deprived areas. This isn't, again, uniformly the case. Dance in Scotland, again, really distinctive patterns, and seems much less socially stratified than other activities and the same activity in other places. But I think it's important to not get complacent and to, think about some of the specific areas and activities where these differences seem a little bit more pronounced. And I want to bring these together because some of this data that I'm about to show you is genuinely quite surprising. So the Scottish Household Survey includes estimates of the percentages of people in each different council area who have been engaging in the activities that I've just described there. Because of the sampling method, I need to be slightly circumspect about this. The confidence intervals around these are relatively broad. I'm going to show you a series of points. Please imagine a certain amount of fuzz around each of those points. But one of the things that we find is that in Scotland, the relationships between the percentage of people who work in arts, culture and heritage occupations and who have attended different kinds of events in the last 12 months varies a lot. The relationships are not especially strong. In most parts of the world, when you have an area with lots of people working in these occupations, these also tend to be areas where people are more likely to do things like go to art galleries, regardless of whether those individuals are working in these occupations or not. In Scotland, you still see these patterns. On average, when you get an area that has more people working in these occupations, you also get more people attending different kinds of events, participating in different forms of culture, such as making crafts or creative writing. But these relationships are pretty weak. Some of the areas with relatively few people working in such occupations nonetheless have very high levels of engagement in certain kinds of activities, such as playing a musical instrument. And so just to give you a couple of takeaways, again, the 62 pages of report, there's a lot of graphs. I figured that it was best to not show you every single one. But just a couple of things to think about are that, as I say, the council areas with the largest percentages of people working in arts, culture and heritage occupations are Edinburgh and Glasgow at the top two, but also the Western Isles in third place. The spatial patternings, geography of cultural work in Scotland is quite unlike what we've seen elsewhere. Cultural engagement is significant and varied. There's loads going on, but it is marked by social inequalities where disability appears to be pretty significant. And then finally, the relationships between employment in arts, culture and heritage occupations and the ways that people spend their time. The strength of those relationships is actually not what we might have expected based on other parts of the world. And I think unpacking those patterns in a bit more detail is worthwhile. I promised I wouldn't talk very long because we've got a really excellent panel that I'm excited to be a part of. So I will wrap things up there. Thank you very much.
Okay, so this is the part of the day where we get to have a fantastic discussion with some real experienced and incredible panelists. So I think we've done the intro for me, so I won't repeat that. But we have going across the panel, we have Brianna Furgado, who's the former chair of the Cultural Fair Work Task Force. Incredible CV. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and an award-winning, lots of awards, social entrepreneur, activist, I'm going to embarrass you now, and author with nearly a decade's experience across creative industries in Scotland. And also, because we're in an academic space, a plug for a recently published book, Making Good Trouble. So, Brianna, thank you for joining us. Kim Simpson, Head of EDI at Creative Scotland, provides strategic leadership for the specialism support of Creative Scotland's strategic framework. And again, another incredible CV, having worked as a strategist and curator and facilitator and coach across the sector, locally, nationally and internationally, again, over a number of years. And she's a Clore Leadership Fellowship. struggling today. CLAW Leadership Fellow. Who knew that was hard to say? And an ISPA Global Fellow. And you know Mark as well, incredible CV, works at the University of Sheffield, one of the authors. And also, again, just to embarrass you, on the College of Experts for DCMS. So that's our panel, and they hopefully bring lots of different things to the discussion. And to start with, I'm really just going to ask you to share one key thing that you think the audience needs to know about you and your career that's helping you contextualise your framings and your remarks for the report.
Afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I think something that is relevant to our discussion today in terms of what's contextualising how I'm approaching this from a fair work perspective is definitely lots of experience I've had over the last few years doing governance, organisational development work across the creative industries, from film to the National Theatre of Scotland to Stellar Pines Theatre Company. But often my work over the past 5 to 6 years has definitely been grounded in arts-led organisations that are grassroots, that are social enterprises that are often Black and POC-led or queer-led. That's very much about not only inequalities within the workforce and the cultural workforce, but the experience of freelancers and self-employed people in the workforce. So that's a lens that I'll be approaching this with today.
Thank you, Brianna. So while I currently work at Creative Scotland and I'm definitely the voice of Creative Scotland, the institution today, I think I also want to share that I arrived at Creative Scotland after a long time of working as a freelancer within the cultural sector. I'm also a disabled person and I come from one of the communities that's in one of those most deprived. So this is a personal thing for me as well as a professional thing. And so when I talk about EDI, it's not just about the language of our institution, it's about understanding how it feels to be somebody who was marginalised and has found my way to this panel and to this stage, and then trying to translate that and use the kind of levers that are available through things like our strategic priorities of EDI and fair work, and also the way that we work within places to try and change some of those patterns. So it'll be interesting to see how this report helps us to do that moving into the future.
Thanks very much. The slides that I just shown and the short presentation that I delivered was obviously heavily concentrated on a series of numbers and a series of graphs. And there's always a danger in that kind of context that somebody comes across as not very interested in artists and creative workers. In the work that I've done, both as a part of Creative PEC and more broadly, I've been taking very much a mixed methods approach, working with great colleagues, that has meant that we have been speaking directly to people who work in arts, culture and heritage, talking to them about their experiences and their trajectories. So in terms of the grounding that I have for the presentation that I've delivered, but also the discussion that we'll have now, it's very heavily informed by those conversations, thinking about the experience of creative work and the experience of attempting to sustain a creative career long term.
Thank you. And I'm going to put you on the spot again, and then you can relax for a little bit, okay? Because obviously I'm going to ask all panelists to just give a quick initial response to the report and to Mark's findings, and not to prejudice how we're going to do that, but you kept distilling it down and down and down. You had 3 takeaways. What's your one takeaway from the report in terms of the things that we really need to focus on today and talk through?
For me, in a Scottish context, but I think probably more broadly, we need to think about the geography of creativity in arts, culture and heritage, and think about the relationships between, let's say, creative work and creative industries. In order to be an artist, you don't have to be living in a space with huge amounts of infrastructure. And as we've seen, lots of people working in Scotland are able to do so. Creativity is everywhere. And there's a question of how we can make sure that the creativity that is everywhere is recognised, including through being able to build good work and sustainable careers.
Thank you. Yeah, that's definitely on the spot. What's my one takeaway? My one takeaway is the report, to be honest. It's I guess it's telling me something that we probably already knew. And it makes me feel very empowered, actually, in the conversations that we need to have internally about how we use the limited resources that we have available to us in the arts to invest in things that are actually going to make meaningful and long-term change. And we have definitely started some of those things. So I think for me, it's just having this kind of additional evidence base that I can use alongside other pieces of research and analysis that we've done to make the case for kind of shifting to those more long-term community-embedded approaches and ways of working.
Thank you. In terms of the key takeaway from the report, it's obviously incredibly rich in terms of the workforce breakdown, in terms of geographically across the country, where we're seeing not only creative workers that are entering the sector, but managers across the cultural sector in Scotland. And I think obviously the data around inequality and marginalised people working in the sector is a kind of massive point to highlight. But the key takeaway from me is that this aligns very much with the Culture Fair Work Task Force recommendations around what's needed for a sustainable workforce in terms of minimum pay standards, in terms of support when workers, particularly within institutions that might not have HR provision, are looking for support around bullying and harassment, in terms of progression for our sector, in terms of, we talked about this a bit this morning, not just early career, but mid-career artists and creative practitioners. Excuse me, and creative practitioners. So it's that it aligns very much and provides an evidence base and further support for what's needed around fair work in Scotland.
Pass the mic. And I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things there. I think, I've said a couple of times we are located in a beautiful university campus where we're looking out, for those in the room, looking out at it today. And I just wanted to unpick that relationship really between evidence and action. And we've got a huge amount of evidence in there, a number of really clear takeaways that we can move through. But how, I'm going to come to you because you mentioned it. So how do you at Creative Scotland and in your position within that say, I'm going to sift through this and this is how I aggregate with other things to make a particular set of decisions? What's your Monday morning? This is what we need to do.
Okay, that is definitely a really tough question. We have been working in another area of development around arts and health, and I think there's some really it's interesting because within that area there's no shortage of evidence that art supports health, and actually we do need to move into okay, what are we actually going to do about that then. From where I sit within our organisation, it's kind of that middle bit of translation between what's happening on the ground in the different sectors that we support, particularly for those that are sitting at margins and intersections of marginalisation, and that they're reflected in the way that we make decisions. So we have an EDI advisory group that's drawn from professionals and people with lived experience that can support our team, which is very small, with some of that other perspective that you need that can be difficult when you're inside an institution. And then to translate that into a set of outcomes or a strategy or a way of working that we then have to ensure that our board and leadership are completely behind and understand. So right now is an interesting time for Creative Scotland because we have just had this review. We're in a process of rewriting our strategy. We've just come to the end of a period of mainstreaming, which means we're setting new outcomes for the next 4 years. And we are also looking at how we distribute our funding. So we have things like Culture Collective already in place, which is about enfranchising and shifting decision-making power to communities about the kind of art that's produced within them. However, we also distribute multi-year funding and open funding, and I think we do recognise that the open fund is where we have the greatest potential to make some quite significant change. So we're in that process at the moment. So it's constant translation, interpretation, trying to pull out the most irrefutable insights from the things that we are using, like this report, like other pieces of evidence, and to kind of back up those, you know, we need to shift to this way of thinking, to this way of working. So I would say that we're in a moment of shifting, where that has both challenges and also a lot of opportunities. So yeah, I don't know, does that answer your question? Okay, great.
I think from the perspective of the Culture Fair Work Task Force, and obviously there was a bit of kind of background and context given to that, but the Culture Fair Work Task Force was set up as a result of kind of recommendations that came out of that culture strategy. But originally, the Culture Fair Work Task Force kind of needs to be set up came out of discussions in the National Partnership for Culture in 2020, when we had art sector leaders come together to think about how to implement the culture strategy during the pandemic. After Culture Radar kind of conducted their Fair Work review and the task force was set up, this kind of wider question about, okay, Scotland's ambition to be a Fair Work nation by 2030, what recommendations actually would further that goal and that aim, but how would that allow Fair Work to be properly implemented across the cultural sector and creative industries? So to answer your question about that kind of, you know, a gap between policy and implementation, I think at the moment we have the recommendations in the report. We've had the Creative Scotland review. There's some really clear recommendations around how can we think about not only resourcing the sector to implement Fair Work, what are fair pay standards, how can unions work together with arts organisations and institutions, do kind of individual workforce members know their rights, also in terms of what we're looking at around data gaps, which I think is part of this kind of gap between that implementation is, okay, we understand our creative workforce, the breakdown of who identifies as an artist, a lot of that is in kind of the report. But what we found when we were looking at the data gaps during the Cultural Fair Work Task Force were the following. How many of our cultural task force members and creative task force members are working across industries and hospitality, in building and construction, in industries where they're working part-time to sustain themselves, but that's not necessarily reflected in the data that we have and we collect. It's not disaggregated to Scotland, and then looking at, of course, all of the other identifying factors and characteristics of which of those workforce members in terms of gender, in terms of class, in terms of race and ethnicity. So I think there's actually some gaps here around, yes, we understand the workforce more, but we can actually learn a lot more from the creative and cultural workforce around if we're looking at fair work practices and looking at the growth of the workforce and the sustainability of it, actually how is the creative workforce being impacted by their experiences across other sectors, and how is that actually compounding experiences within the creative workforce that might prevent progression or sustainability or might contribute to a brain drain. So I think those kind of components and aspects, obviously Creative Scotland is doing work to look at this. We have arts organisations like the Scottish Contemporary Art Network, Craft Scotland. There's a lot of work happening in film at the moment with Film Hub that will be announced, and some other kind of work that's coming through. But what can we not only learn from those other industries, but how are we making sure we're tracking this, we're understanding the needs, and how does that kind of reflect all of the brilliant work that's in the report?
Thank you. And I guess this might also be an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it.
Yeah.
Because you're launching a report today, so I'm guessing all the team involved have just been focused on the launch. But I'm going to ask you a little bit in that context of action, implementation, the timeliness of this kind of thinking that's happening at a local and national scale and hyper-local scale sometimes. So the afterlife of the report, and what's the role of that evidence base in helping some of that implementation gap? Because we often find there's an amazing amount of material and you've had lots and lots of reports. So if you don't want to speak to this one, we speak to early ones as well. But what is that? What's the afterlife in the context of implementation?
One of the things that I found from having been working as part of this team for a couple of years now is that when we have published online dashboards where people can look at a particular council area or local authority, particular occupational group, something like that, those are some of the things that get used most heavily. When I publish a map as a part of a PDF, people are not going to be able to zoom into exactly where they live and have a look at exactly which shade of orange is included to figure out exactly what percentage they're talking about. But when they load up the dashboards, they can. And so we found that that's been one of the sort of afterlives of the work that we've been publishing, which has been most effective. The other thing that we've not talked about today, which is always a little bit sensitive, but I think it will form an important part of the research that we do in the next year or so, is thinking about money. When we're talking about, what are the problems associated with fair work, what are the problems associated with different forms of participation, the cuts to cultural sectors, both through direct government grants and also via council areas and local authorities since 2010-ish, have been really pronounced. And so thinking about exactly how that funding has changed, not just how much money is there, but where is it coming from and where is it going? I'm worried about going into a Cotton Eye Joe riff here, so I'm going to move swiftly on. Is going to be critical. And then thinking about where else money might be coming from, because routes into cultural funding is not limited to money coming from DCMS, from Creative Scotland, from the Scottish Government, but also thinking about other funders, forms of philanthropy, and so on. And so personally, I'm thinking quite heavily in this space at the moment. A lot of the recommendations that we make in the report, and a lot of the recommendations that have been seen in, for example, the review of Creative Scotland, the review of Arts Council England, if all of the recommendations are going to be implemented, the money is going to have to come from somewhere. And so thinking about where that money might be and what sorts of numbers we're talking about is where I see some of, if I was reading my own reports, I would be thinking, okay, and now you need to tell us about the money. And so that's where I'm hoping to go in the future.
I think money is definitely a big factor. And when we're thinking about the kind of implementation of these recommendations and policy interventions, we cannot forget about the work that's being done on the ground by creative networks, by collectives, by individual artists that are running studio spaces, that are doing that work of knowledge brokerage within kind of the cultural sector, by working with artists, by collecting that data, but by providing support. But I think that fundamental question of money is a massive one. When we look at what's come out of the Creative Scotland review, the amount of data that has come out of a piece of research that Lindsay Dunbar did on how much time cultural sector leaders are spending applying for Creative Scotland funding, and that's Creative Scotland, that's not to mention other trusts and foundations. I think this question, though, of independent money, of philanthropic funding is a massive part of the debate just now in Scotland, particularly over the last 2 years when it comes to the questions around ethical funding, ethical investment, when it comes to where is that money coming from in terms of funding our public engagement programs, education work. But I think the kind of gap and the cuts in funding in the last 12 years has of course massively impacted the sector. But as the sector has become more agile, more innovative, has crowdfunded, the wider issue of, okay, if we're talking about philanthropy, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think I remember the figure, high net worth individuals in Scotland, I think 3% donate any money to cultural sector kind of assets. So if we're actually talking about philanthropic interventions, what does that actually look like? Do those relationships exist? How might those relationships develop? Is there capacity within the sector to kind of go do that development work? And also when we're talking about kind of the capacity within our cultural institutions, we have so many people that are working across cultural institutions and of course have their own independent practice, and that kind of collective burnout, the time poverty, all of the kind of wider impacts of actually looking for additional funding is a massive issue. And I think when we talk about also instrumentalizing the cultural sector and creative workforce around health and well-being, of course that's important, but also we need to kind of protect art for art's sake and our cultural assets and creative workforce for art's sake. So I think there's a lot of increased pressure as well on our creative workforce to deliver outcomes kind of that are important, that are essential, that are fundamental, but that are putting an increasing pressure on the kind of, and I don't want to frame it this way, but the core work of the sector. So I think that's a kind of consideration as well.
I feel like we could really unpack so much of that for a very long time, and I hope that we will. But for right now, there's a few things I maybe just want to touch on. And again, this is a conversation that's happening in so many spaces, again, in the arts and health context. Where do we get the money? Where, so I guess there's a couple of things I want to mention. Creative Scotland distributes funding for Scottish Government and also National Lottery. But the work that we are currently doing on our arts and mental health framework is actually in partnership with the Behring Foundation, which is a private trust. And we've built a relationship with them since they were focusing on creative aging, and have worked within that context, and also around isolation and loneliness. So there are some examples of where these partnerships with other types of funder are coming up. We also have organisations like Arts, Culture and Business, I think they're called now. So they're there. There are some things there already. The other sorts of things that are worth pointing to within Creative Scotland, which, as you know, has to be noted, we are just one funder in a whole ecosystem, and the people that we fund are not everybody that practices art or creative activity in Scotland by any stretch of the imagination. So we can only kind of influence along with others and work with Scottish Government and other funders like National Lottery to try and I guess release some more resources. But some things like the Creative Industries team are doing a really brilliant piece of work with Crowdfunder, where they're matching, and it's a much simpler application process. It's assessed in a slightly different way, and it's much more immediate in terms of unlocking resources. And then also within the public sector in Scotland, you know, there's been lots said about the increases of investment into arts and culture, particularly from Humza Yousaf's time in Scottish Government. However, I think the Culture Counts work that they've done recently highlights that even with that, there's still a sort of real terms cut in terms of how much money is actually in the sector and in the industry. So some of the ways that we're looking at is through public services reform. Again, arts and health is an area where there may be shared resourcing, where we can take the pressure off some of those art for art's sake resources, where things are working in a more social impact or personal impact or instrumentalized arts kind of way. So it's all conversations, you know, and it's advocacy. We are an advocacy body as well. Part of our job is to have these conversations with other public bodies, and our chief executive does sit on one of the public service reform areas. But it's also, it can be tricky, because at the same time as we're delivering more in terms of the resources we distribute, we're also experiencing reductions in terms of the operational budgets we have available to do so. So everyone is pressed. And I think what this is really, this report is kind of bringing me very into like stark relief, is that we just need to think differently about how we're doing it. And if we keep trying to deliver things using the systems that are not delivering the outcomes we're looking for, then we need to start looking at how we shift those systems. And I would say things like Culture Collective and crowdfunding and public services reform are the institutional ways that we're starting to approach that. So there's always more that we can do, but this is part of how we get there.
We're now going to move on to the place-based dimensions, and then sort of finish off with the sort of people-based dimensions, if you like. And I wonder, Mark, if I could just turn to you to just kind of briefly highlight really interesting finding that I thought in the report around this sort of agglomeration, micro clusters, urban, rural, doesn't really play out in a lot of the literature and a lot of the other place-based contexts. So if you could maybe share that with us, and I'll ask Kim and Brianna to respond.
Yeah, so one of the things, just to reiterate, that we've seen here is the areas that have got a lot of artists, a lot of musicians, a lot of crafts workers are not necessarily the largest cities in Scotland. We also see that some of the areas which have got the council areas that have got the largest percentages of people working in these occupations immediately border some of the areas with the smallest percentages of people working in these occupations. And this is an unusual finding. Having said that, one of the things that we know is that creativity does not follow council area borders. It's not as if when I step across from, so, you know, I work in Sheffield, if I hop across to Barnsley, I don't feel that transition. Similarly, in Scotland, in Scottish cities, in rural areas in Scotland, we know that it's very likely that there's areas of creative concentration that are potentially much, much smaller. In my colleague Josh Seipel's work, who works as part of the Creative PEC, he's published a report called Geographies of Creativity that looks both at how you see microclusters within local authorities and council areas, but also the bridge between them. And my suspicion is that a lot of the patterns that we see today, where there are certain council areas that might have higher percentages of people working in creative occupations, arts, culture and heritage occupations than might have been expected, I bet those are in smaller areas. Highland is enormous. I would be astonished if the distribution of people in Highland who work as artists, where we're looking at exactly 1 per 10 square miles. There will be some areas with loads, and there will be some areas that don't have as many. And so on the one hand, I'm really excited to see to have developed these findings already, because a lot of them were quite surprising to me. But I'd also love to go further and to look, building on the work that I've talked about today, but also my colleague Josh's work, thinking about how we can disentangle this to a greater extent. Back to you.
Hello. So we just did our mainstreaming report, which is basically where we report on what we said we would do for the last 4 years. And during this time, thanks to the work of our brilliant knowledge and research team, the head of whom is at the back of the room, Yay for Knowledge and Research, we are now able to track success rates based on without, revealing personal data. We're able to understand in terms of disability, geography, age, etc., who is actually succeeding when they apply to our funding. Now, it's not perfect. We don't get 100% response rates. However, it does give us a bit of a snapshot into what's actually happening. And so it's interesting to see that there's such a high concentration of artists in some of the places that we see are often less successful in terms of actually securing funding from Creative Scotland, because this isn't asking who gets funding from Creative Scotland, it's asking who works in the arts, cultural and heritage sectors. That includes Historic Environment Scotland, Museums and Galleries Scotland, national organisations. So again, we're getting a picture of who's looking to be resourced to deliver artistic activity in their area. And that's where the infrastructure challenge comes. Because if you're in Glasgow and you're surrounded by other people that are applying to things like our Open Fund, then you're able to access lots of knowledge and networks and people who've done it before and people to work with. And in places where there's a lower density of population, it just requires more thinking and intention to bring those kind of infrastructures together. So there's a huge opportunity in the numbers of artists that the report reveals. I think that's incredible. The question now is, how do we support them to be able to access resources in the same ways that people in the Central Belt are maybe more able to do more easily? Okay, great.
Thank you. And I think as you just said, the report kind of gets into this and shows us some real clarity around this. But we obviously have creative hubs across the country that have been rich, that are centres for creative practice and for the creative workforce. But I think as well, when we're looking at trends and looking at what artists and creative practitioners are needing, affordable rent, affordable cost of living, being embedded in a community, having access to public services, I think a lot of creative practitioners in the workforce are asking themselves, well, where can I move to? Where will I be better supported? Where can I actually kind of ground down roots? And I think when we're kind of, just to clarify earlier, when I was talking about arts for art's sake, what I mean by that is artists and creative practitioners are deeply embedded in community and in our society. I don't want to generalize every creative practitioner, but a creative practitioner will be socially focused, will be thinking about the climate crisis, will be thinking about health and social care, will be embedded into community simply by cooperating, collaborating with other artists and creative practitioners. So that real benefit and asset that always exists around creative communities, asking a kind of creative practitioner to do more on top of what their practice already entails and what they're interested in is a big ask. That's my kind of point around protecting and supporting art for art's sake. But when it comes to kind of place-based a kind of place-based approach to this and scope to this, when we look at the growth of particularly our creative networks in the last 10 years, Creative Dundee, Creative Stirling, Creative Glasgow just launched last year, Creative Edinburgh, Creative Inverclyde, the kind of investment and the focus also on kind of place-based creative enterprise development, particularly looking at how that's also developing within our unis across the country, thinking about this from, yes, the need to distribute support better, that's not just focused on the Central Belt, but also thinking about actually there's so much activity happening across the country from that enterprise perspective, from that place-based perspective. It needs to be better supported, of course. And that question of how is funding distributed and how are resources distributed, yes, it's a question of infrastructure, but assuming as well, which we're not, that people want to be in the Central Belt, they want to be kind of across the country. So actually what is needed kind of in each local authority area, in each council area, and kind of using different models to approach their creative practice and kind of development of kind of creative infrastructure.
Thank you, Bianna. You reminded me as well that I have a bit of a personal bugbear as well, and it's one that I've had for years, which is even before I worked at Creative Scotland, we'd quite frequently be saying, how do we solve X problem and blah, blah, blah. And a lot of the time would be, we need a database or we need a central location where we can find all the information. And I think that is actually like a huge mental model that we need to get past. There's no such thing as too many networks. Like networks is how you create connective tissue and social cohesion, and people are able to move between them regardless of where they are, so that you can move from a network that's devised around a lived experience and hold space for that. But that the people within that network can also move into another one that might be more about enterprise, or that might be about trying to widen their understanding of a particular geographic location. And a point on that is that networks can also be challenging, because for disabled people particularly, that can feel very tyrannical, that you have to be part of a network and you have to do networking. So I think we have to really expand our understanding of what we mean when we say network, and that just because we have one over here doesn't mean we've done the work. It's more networks. We just need more networks so that information is being shared, and we have to get over the fact that there's just never going to be a central place where all the information that one person needs to do their thing is going to be available, and that it's going to be an exercise in relationship development and finding the things that are useful for you in your context. So yeah, moving away from centralizing to networks.
Thank you. And I guess that we haven't rehearsed this, but that kind of works really well, because in place-based work, there's no one size fits all. And actually something we've been thinking about a lot in the programme led by Lucrezia is about that relational infrastructure. We often focus on the physical infrastructure of delivering a theatre or whatever it might be, but actually that relational infrastructure across places, the connectivity within and across, is actually crucial. And that takes us to our kind of last set of questions, really, which is about sort of people dimension of this work, both the workforces and the audience, or part of people in participation. And I'm going to go positive. It's a sunny day, right? Not too sunny, but it's Glasgow. But I am going to go positive, because we hear a lot about the challenges, right? And there's a lot of difficulty, and there's a real realism around the structural and material conditions that shape a lot of this work. But in your report, there was some positivity too, right? And so I wonder about opportunities. You know, if you were writing this report in the next 5 years, next 10 years, what's the big opportunity for either the workforce, the audience, or people who participate?
I'd start by coming back to what we've just been talking about networks. So many of the opportunities for good things to happen involve people working, like people want to help. This point about there is no central database which has everything that you want to find in it. It's also true that if you're able, like, people want to help, and it's not necessarily always obvious who is the right person to ask, who is going to be the right person, who will have the relevant contacts. But in my experience, if the person that you ask doesn't know, they'll probably know somebody who does. You might have to go through a few steps. Everyone's busy. It might not be quick. But I think where there are a lot of opportunities here are thinking about how people can work together in order to build things. And this both corresponds to sort of practical infrastructure, making sure that, networks are infrastructure. You don't need to have a building in order for there to be infrastructure so that things can continue to work together. And there is, you're not reliant on if this one person moves away or retires, then the things that we need are no longer accessible. It's something that I think you can see both in terms of the workforce activity, where there are real clusters going on that if we were able to support and sustain those, they can potentially build into something really cool. They weren't all, and that's all right. Making sure there are opportunities for people to take risks and try things out, I think is really valuable as well. Similarly, in the participation work, where people are already engaging in fun and exciting ways that might not necessarily be what we've predicted, that's something that should be encouraged rather than try to sort of confront it as like, you're doing it in the wrong way. If we can scale that up in other places, brilliant. Sometimes it'll be really place specific. Something that works in one location isn't necessarily going to work in another location. And so sensitivity to those local contexts is valuable as well. We can learn things from particular places that don't involve saying, well, we're just going to do exactly the same thing somewhere else. I realize that's a little vague, but if nothing else, people want to help.
I think coming back to Mark's point and also Kim's point about networks and the accessibility of them, I think that's a massive point. We've not kind of talked about AI, technology, online spaces, virtual spaces, and I think we're seeing a lot of tension here, obviously, around this in terms of the use of AI, its rapid development, all of the discussions happening around data centres, particularly in Edinburgh, but across the country, across the UK, across the world. I think when we are talking about networks, yes, traditional forms of networking might not be accessible to a lot of people, but I think actually when we look at how people are gathering and also kind of experiences, yes, of younger generations and generations, well, it's intergenerational by social isolation. I think this wider question, which can be, excuse me, not answered by the creative industries and creative practitioners, but comes from artists, comes from world building, comes from future visioning, is this question of how do we gather, how are we in community? Yes, kind of different aspects of our identity mean that we might feel attracted to, safe in getting resources from different networks at different points. But I think the opportunity here, particularly when we're looking at some of the data around the activities that people tend to engage with, when we're talking about audience members and participants, people making music, there wasn't a big kind of disparity between different groups of people from different backgrounds, for example, of music making, and again, how accessible that is due to social media, kind of the internet, online sources. I think the opportunity here is with ethical approaches and considerations to how we're using data and AI and tech in general, is we are really fundamentally, globally, really questioning our institutional structures, our institutions, leadership, power, how power is distributed. I think artists and creative practitioners have always challenged that and showed us different ways of organizing, of working, of living, of being. So the opportunity here is this is a sector and a workforce that has the means to help us explore that as a society more widely. And there are genuinely opportunities for us to use what we have, be innovative by using even our scarce resources to think about actually how do we not only make creativity accessible to audience members and members of the public that would say a gallery is not for me, or going to theatre is not for me, or opera is not for me, but actually thinking about allowing artists and creative practitioners to lead, not using our traditional methods and models to think about engagement, even though participation is so important and participatory frameworks are so important, but allowing artists and creative practitioners to go, how are we restructuring, reapproaching how we are engaging with art, how we're organizing ourselves, how we're presenting it, how we're curating it, and letting that be led by, yes, the tech and kind of data and kind of access to information, but being hopeful that actually the way we are restructuring our power dynamics and our institutions will allow for more engagement. I know that's sounding maybe too hopeful, but there's real opportunity there.
Thank you. Yeah, again, so much rich perspective here. I'm thinking a lot about brains and neural pathways, and this idea that when when we have to reach out or cross a distance or ask somebody for something and follow a path, that actually we're creating a neural pathway, and that is the making of the networks that we need and we rely on. The other thing, in terms of the actual data and where the participation gaps actually exist, particularly for disabled people and socioeconomically diverse communities or underprivileged communities, the area that the project that we're doing at the moment that I think has the most potential to shift that is one that deals with the physical spaces that some of this work happens in. So, and that is what I noticed. Those top lines are going to a venue to see theatre, going to a venue to see the cinema, going to a space. And so we are working with all the arts councils in the UK on a programme called All In. We're also working with Arts Council of the Republic of Ireland as well. And All In is effectively an access passport for the disabled person. So they only have to tell you what their access requirements are once. And that passport then exists across every single venue that has signed up for it. In addition to that, it's harmonising and creating a set of standards. So from every organisation that talks about their access provision in a completely different way, Attitude is Everything have now created a set of 92 standards, accessibility standards. And the point is that whether you're a tiny venue as part of a rural touring network, or whether you're the Lyceum Theatre, you can figure out where it is that you are on your journey of making your venue accessible, and then start to make progress quite quickly and quite immediately. And you can access support from the people that organise this, which is us and the team that we work with in England and Wales and in Northern Ireland. The other aspect of this that's really important is we're funding it at the moment, but it's an incubation. We're helping it get started. There's already interest from commercial venues. So when you're talking about things like how do we resource change in infrastructure in different ways, we've come up with an offer that is actually attractive to some of the bigger venues. And the member bodies, the organisations that are signed up to this, they will pay into it. It will start to create resources for some of those changes to happen. Now, there are still challenges around capital development, actually making building adaptations. That's the same with climate as well. But this is how you start to close the participation gaps in those areas where we're seeing them. And I don't think it's an accident that that's in the physical places that we're asking people to gather.
Thanks. My name's Mark Banks. I'm from the University of Glasgow. My question, I suppose it's mostly for Mark, really, is you've been admirably circumspect and diplomatic, Mark, in laying out the data, but not sort of making too many claims as to sort of explanation. But I'd like to sort of slightly push you on that, I suppose. So the distribution of cultural workers, identified predominantly in Glasgow, Edinburgh, but also in the Western Isles. I suppose intuitively we might expect to find that because we know, of course, that the Highlands and Islands are, of course, a big tourism economy. But I was thinking about the sort of different other kinds of maps and layering we could do with such a distribution. So we might, of course, want to link the cultural economy to, patterns of tourism, but we might also want to layer on things like distribution of FE, HE, public sector, and so on. So I suppose our question really is to sort of get you to speculate a bit more on the relationship of the cultural economy to the broader economic geography of Scotland, whether you can say with some kind of confidence what that relationship might be. And I suppose the second point was to sort of push you to say a little bit more about the apparent disjuncture between location and sort of participation engagement in cultural activities that you were alluding to, which is really a really interesting finding, I think. But maybe whether you had any thoughts as to why that sort of patterning is played out would be really interesting to hear.
Perfect. So that is a question that's also been asked by Helen Duncan online. So on exactly that difference between employment and engagement, and whether that can be partially explained by tourism. We've also got a question on the data from Claire, who is a professor of publishing at Stirling. Just wondering if there is some distinguished data between book publishing versus newspapers and journalism, if you have that available. And we also have a question if the panelists could speak to the heritage aspect on the difference between the arts and culture versus the heritage, environment, archaeology and conservation, especially in terms of the split across policy domains of public sector organisations. What impacts are there on the evidence gathering and policy making? So.
Probably quite a lot to hold in your head, so we'll take these.
I'll start with the easier one, and then as it gets more difficult, I'll pretend that I forgot them. The very quick one on Claire's question about distinguishing between different roles. So if you go into the dashboards, you can see the specific occupations in there. So you can break it apart by people working as authors, for example, as compared with people working in newspapers. Claire's given me a beautiful segue because the council area with the largest, I've talked about artists quite a lot. The council area with the largest percentage of people working as, quote, managers and directors in the creative industries is in fact Stirling. And the reason why I bring this up and the reason why I think it's interesting is that just because somebody lives there doesn't mean they work there. You know, I have spent quite a lot of my time while in Scotland, both this week and in my life, on the train. It is very clear that there's a lot of commuting. People live in all sorts of different places, and just because they live somewhere doesn't mean that they work there as well. So coming back to your question about economic geography, part of it is about infrastructure. I'm not sure if it's the biggest employer in the creative industries in Scotland, but one of the biggest is Rockstar North, who are the people that made Grand Theft Auto. It is an enormous employer. It's very, very close to Waverley, unless they've moved. And, you know, originally from Dundee, Dundee has is the home of Lemmings, amongst other things. And part of it is about infrastructure, where if there are offices, if there is tech, that means that people can't work from home. Similarly, in film and TV production, lots of activity needs to take place in a particular location. And so part of the economic geography is infrastructure. Part of the economic geography is, as has been talked about, probably, I always think that the most effective interventions in cultural policy are to do with housing. If creative workers are able to live somewhere in stable ways, then it's going to contribute towards their creative careers more effectively. But it's also part of what else is going on. All of the numbers that I've talked about in terms of the distribution of creative workers has been to do with percentages. Percentage of people working in arts, culture and heritage occupations in Aberdeen is pretty low, because we all know that the dominant industries in Aberdeen, obviously this is different from 10 or 15 years ago, but the percentage of people working in oil and gas and natural resources in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire are quite a bit higher. And so when we're talking about percentages, the percentage of people who can be creative workers ends up being a little bit lower. So that's not all of it, but you can definitely identify certain parts of Scotland. You know, I've measured it through council areas, but you can think of it in lots of different ways. Part of it is explained through infrastructure, part of it is explained through housing, part of it is explained by the other industries that are more or less visible in those places. We had quite a lot of questions and we've got 1 minute, so I'm going to hand over to my fellow panelists. Back to you.
Maybe pick up the heritage question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the only one we've not. No.
I think I would get into trouble if I started to speak for Historic Environment or Museums and Galleries Scotland. There's a different body that looks after those, but I will say that they are part of a creative cluster around public services reform. So I will feed back and make sure that Ian, our chief executive, is completely aware of this research and the questions around heritage, and that they're coming up in those conversations too. But yeah, I'm not going to talk about that.
Historic Environment Scotland, Museums and Galleries Scotland, and then Visit Scotland were part of the Culture Fair Work Task Force. I think the task of setting cultural policy or exploring recommendations around fair work across several aspects of the cultural sector and creative industries is incredibly challenging. From the perspective of our kind of heritage colleagues, a lot of their, and I won't speak for them obviously in terms of discussions that were confidential in the task force, but in terms of their, you know, their recruitment policies, their HR policies, thinking about setting standards of pay, you know, our kind of heritage colleagues were very firm about that in terms of their kind of approach. So, you know, I think that there's so much brilliant work happening around fair work within kind of the heritage sector. And when we're also thinking about, again, you know, when it comes to tourism, when it comes to historic sites, when it comes to how people are engaging with those sites, accessing them physically, feeling a sense of belonging to them, there's still a lot of work though to do around who feels that they can access that.
Just a quick follow-up question on that, a technical clarification maybe, but Mark, I was wondering with the thing about, you know, the relationship between people, I presume it's people who live in a particular council area and work in creative jobs versus attendants, working in the council area in creative jobs but not participating, or is it that in the areas with high working levels, there are also high participation levels, but there are some areas with low working levels but higher participation levels? I'm thinking those might be the ones who are travelling to venues, but.
Thanks very much. So my question was whether there's any kind of comparative research or data with the Republic of Ireland, because my feeling, although I don't know to what extent that would be borne out, is that there may be some similar dynamics specifically between Scotland and the Republic of Ireland. And that leads to a second question, which is to what extent in your discussions, maybe particularly around fair work, is the basic income for the arts in the Republic of Ireland featuring?
Hello, Julie Neeson, Creative Dundee, sitting next to Rosemary from Creative Glasgow's. Thank you for the shout outs to the networks. On that note, I think we often feel, I certainly do feel like I play a Jekyll and Hyde role all the time in the creative industries, right? And things like the UK's creative industry sector vision networks, creative networks are not represented, and it's still very much about the dominant metric around growth. Given we are the world's first community wealth building country, can you give us some hope in the direction of travel for the UK's creative industry, specifically in Scotland, please?
So I'll answer the question about Ireland, because that is one where I feel like I have an answer. So the short answer is not that I know about, particularly not a direct comparison of here, you know, here's a series of identical questions, here's a series of numbers. That's the bad news. The good news is that there is, you'll know more about this than me, a little while ago, the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Irish Research Council advertised a call for people to, for networking grants in the study of creative industries between the two nations in order to do some comparative work. Obviously, I don't know who's bid. I haven't been asked to review any of the applications. If either of those things weren't true, I wouldn't be able to tell you, but I promise they're both true, which means that I am a little bit optimistic that maybe in a year's time or maybe 2 years' time, some of the projects that HRC and Research Ireland chooses to fund might be doing some of that work. I don't know if you can tell us when we will know what those will be. Fair enough.
If it's all right, I'll say something a little bit about the network stuff and that thing around community wealth building and creative industries networks. I go back to the sort of shifting sands of the time that we're in, and within the EDI area of work, the way that we approach our, I don't want to get into the details of how Creative Scotland distributes money, it's boring for everyone, but we do have, probably not, but we do have an annual budget cycle where every department can access some resources to deliver on more strategic or targeted activity. And when we do that, it has to fit within or contribute to one of three areas. One is access, visibility, and leadership. of diverse and underrepresented people who are working in culture in Scotland. The second is networks and infrastructure. And sometimes that's an organisation, but things like the Nook Collective, which is a neurodiversity-led network that supports and resources other neurodivergent practitioners, that came through the work of our team, and they are now part of our multi-year funding network. So we are, and also I would say, if you're looking for optimism or real kind of progress in this area, it's our Place Partnerships and Communities team. It's our Creative Learning and Young People team, who are doing brilliant work with youth-led funding, who are doing community will transfer actions, all the time. That's a key principle in how they work. And I think, what I'm taking from this, or a moment of waking up a little bit for me, is we need to be leaning more on that kind of infrastructure and using those sorts of activities and networks to achieve some of the other priorities that we're trying to progress, because otherwise we're just going to keep tinkering around the edges, and that's not very helpful.
So starting with community asset transfer and kind of wealth building. One of the roles I've had over the last 2 years is working with the UK Creative Communities Fellowship as a faculty member. So it's UK-based artists and community leaders and social entrepreneurs in the arts across the UK coming together to think about, building resources, building capacity. And I think what's interesting is we did one run of this in County Durham, looking at the kind of real deprivation around cultural assets, around support, around funding, and thinking about this just in comparison to Scotland and what you've been saying about with the fact that you brought up community asset transfer. We stand community asset transfer. We want it to grow. I think it's incredibly important when we think about not just sharing and building wealth, reclaiming buildings, being able to kind of develop community interest companies that support that. But Scotland is leading the charge with this. I don't like to just throw the word innovative out. It's not innovative. It's a future-looking way forwards. And I think there needs to be more investment and support in communities getting the resources they need to do it. Obviously, there's already national organisations that support with those resources and getting people to understand those assets exist and what the process is. But when we're looking at, scarcity around studio space, around venues, around making sure that these buildings and spaces are not taken on by corporations. When we look at the decline of high streets, I think this is an incredibly important model that we've seen with Scottish Design Exchange and so many other places across the country, in Dundee as well. So I think it's a brilliant way forward, and it's a sustainable way forward. It's a way to think about degrowth. It's a way to think about post-growth models, and I think that's really, really important. Really quickly on basic income, there was an event last week about this. Through the Culture Fair Work Task Force, we looked at a couple of things. We looked at the Living Wage Foundation's model of living hours as a way for workers that were working on hourly wages to kind of have a set standard for that hourly pay and be able to hold employers accountable. When we're looking at that in the context of basic income and all of the issues that are impacting not just artists and creative practitioners, but people that are struggling with affording to live, cost of living. Within the task force, we looked at a number of models. We looked to France, we looked to Belgium, we looked to Australia, we looked at a model in California. There have been basic income pilots in Scotland across the country, numerous of them for 10 years. I remember a pilot in East Lothian in 2015. The recommendation was for us to recommend to government and Scottish ministers to look at the possibility of a pilot for a basic income scheme. And the reason we chose that wording and that approach is there was a massive debate within the Culture Fair Work Task Force around, are we recommending universal basic income or are we recommending basic income for artists? And the kind of compromise and the thought around that was we can recommend the pilot. When we made the recommendation and the report came out December last year, obviously we were starting to see the impact of the Irish pilot, the impact on health and well-being, people being able to have a pension, people being able to get married, get a mortgage, not be struggling with their mental health because they can't access public public services. And I think the kind of central question around basic income is how could we afford it in Scotland? What would that cost be? Will that require cuts to other fundamental public services? When you look into kind of that Irish model and where some of that money was coming from tax income, from larger corporations, that's a kind of big factor. There's a massive basic income for artists campaign run by Cleo Goodman. This has obviously been picking up since the election and manifesto promises and asks, and we will see what happens. But I think there's still a question of resourcing it. How will it be distributed? Who will be chosen for that pilot? Who will benefit? How will it be monitored and evaluated? And what is the true impact? But we've seen some of that data in Ireland in terms of a kind of, you can look at that data, but a return on investment in terms of contribution kind of economically, gross value added, but also per capita for artists that's received that basic income. It's been successful, it's been recommended to move forward, but there are obviously nuances to that. But we did support the recommendation for the exploration of a pilot.
I'm thinking about the fact that what we do in the arts is not divorced from what's happening socially, and that I think a lot about the shift from market economy to market society. So things like, you know, your point there about is it an artist basic income or is it a universal basic income? That's a really fundamental question, because we're not going to solve all of the problems of like engagement in the arts simply by looking at it through the lens of arts. It's got to also be about what matters to people and what's actually preventing them from participating, which is often health, time poverty, childcare, having the money to do it. So I think there's a lot more to this, but there's plenty that we can move forward with as well.
Yeah, so if I just take one final question from online, it's a good one to end on, just from Ashley Smith-Hammond, who has asked, looking at the dashboards online, which are obviously available for England and have now been updated today as well with some new data. So just wondering what the, if that will still be updated for Scotland now that that work has been done, if there's plans for that for annual updates over time to provide more longitudinal data for Scotland in the same way as there is for the English feed.
Always nice to be able to talk about dashboards. So I don't want to make any promises, but they should be. Annually, probably not, but not because I don't want to do it. So broadly, I would say there are two kinds of dashboards. So there are the ones that are based on census data. In Scotland, the most recent census took place in 2022. I will not be updating that for the next few years because, God willing, there will not be another census that takes place until 2031. In terms of the data on participation, the way that participation data is collected across the 4 nations of the UK is a bit different. The data that I was talking about earlier is actually a little bit older than people might have expected, because the data that I was talking about isn't collected in a consistent format every year. It's a rotating module within the Scottish Household Survey. However, when it comes back and when that data becomes available, we will be doing our best to refresh that on a relatively timely basis. Similarly, again, I'm slightly making a rod from my own back here. If anybody found themselves thinking, oh, there was some data that we were really anticipating would be included as a part of a dashboard, there's this really valuable data set, please do tell me. And then if that's something that is relatively straightforward to implement, then we will do our best to do so as quickly as we can.
Thank you very much. So I think I'm standing between you and lunch now. So I think it's just my job to give a close and some thanks. So thank you very much to the Creative PEC team for all of your work, to the Place team for your work, and also the University of Glasgow's tech, events, catering, which you will experience team as well as all of you online who have joined us. Thank you so much for giving up some time, as well as those of you in the room. And finally, but not least, last and least, but thank you to the panelists and to the authors of the report. I think it's given us a really productive and optimistic, with some realism, directions to take for the future. So a round of applause to everybody and all of you.